Does pay to laugh, doesn't it? Now let's hear some views on the major issues of the day and perhaps the week ahead. Joining us today, Labor MP and Assistant Minister for the Republic, amongst other things, Matt Thistlethwaite is right here in the studio, and New South Wales Liberal Senator and Shadow Assistant Climate Change Minister Holly Hughes joins us again from Sydney. Welcome back, Holly. I might start, if it's okay, Holly, with a question to Matt, who made some headlines of his own in recent days. Of course, much of our conversation today is going to be dominated by the Morrison Ministries. But Matt, wearing your Republic hat, you'd said, for those not familiar, if we had a head of state appointed by the Australian people, then it's your view that the Prime Minister would not have gotten away with this. And what do you still stand by it? And on what did you base that view?
Yeah, I do, Greg. I think that the principal tenet of our form of democracy is responsible government and accountability to the Parliament. Now, the former Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, blew that out of the water by being sworn into these ministries secretly, not informing the ministers, but also not informing the Parliament. Now, when you look at the role of the Governor-General, I don't blame the Governor-General at all. I think he did what he was enshrined to do, and that is to act on the advice of the Prime Minister. But I can't help but feel, if we had an Australian head of state that was responsible to the Australian people, that swore allegiance to the Australian people, I couldn't help but think that they would have to insist that a Prime Minister that sought to do this disclose it to the Australian people. And I think it raises the argument about why we need to have that discussion once again.
OK, I don't want to spend too long on what we could turn a whole interview into, but does that mean, am I entitled to assume that you're a direct popular election sort of a guy? And if you were, why wouldn't we have more of a crisis if one person, President, who we could effectively call a politician because they've won an election to get there, is pitched against another politician called the Prime Minister? Why wouldn't it be more of a to-do around that tension?
Well, we don't have a particular model in mind. That's something that we'll work through with the Australian people. And I want this to be an issue that unites the Australian people around the notion of a model that works. But regardless of whether it's appointed by the Parliament, appointed by the Australian people, if the current Governor-General is appointed by the Queen, swears allegiance to the Queen, not the Australian people.
At the Prime Minister's recommendation?
Yes. But if the head of state was obliged to swear allegiance to the Australian people, to act on their behalf to protect the Constitution, I can't see how the Prime Minister could get away with swearing themselves into a ministry and then not disclosing that. I think that the head of state would have to say, listen, Prime Minister, I've just sworn you into these ministries, you've got to disclose it.
All right.
And I insist on you doing that.
Well, there's the argument from Matt. Holly, does it hold water?
I think it's based on a whole lot of hypotheticals there. We don't know at all what model's being proposed whatsoever. And as you rightly point out, Greg, the Governor-General is at the recommendation of the Prime Minister. So if one of those models was at the, appointed by Parliament, it would still potentially be someone nominated by a Prime Minister. I think it's probably clutching at straws a little bit there.
All right. Well, why don't we move on to some broader themes in the wash-up from the Morrison Ministries matter, Holly? And would you be on board? Would you be supportive of some sort of review to ensure this doesn't happen again? It looks like it may be on the cards as early as tomorrow.
Well, I think it'll be interesting to see what the Solicitor General's advice is to the Prime Minister tomorrow. I think it's important that we get an oversight of that. I feel that there's been a shift in some language around this where there were claims of it potentially being something that was of a legal nature, and those are being walked back from very, very quickly. So it'll be interesting to see what that advice is tomorrow when all of Australians find out about it. Again, this has been something I've struggled to really fully comprehend what had happened, why it's happened. So perhaps an inquiry wouldn't be the worst thing in the world, but it would need to be a genuine inquiry, not a witch hunt. And I think that's what needs to be kept in mind.
You say you struggle, Holly. Do you condemn it? Do you criticise it?
Look, I'm not going to use that sort of language. I can understand, particularly in the early days of the pandemic, why certain powers may have been enacted or put in place, because we really didn't know what was going to happen. We weren't clear on how it was being transmitted. There was a lot of uncertainty. There was also a lot of anxiety in the Australian population at the time. So I can understand some of those earlier ones. I do struggle a little bit to understand what was the point of some of the later ones. So I think that is something that we do probably as Australians all need to understand a little bit better. But if we are going to have a review into the handling of the pandemic, which I think this is potentially part of, it shouldn't just be federally focused. It's important to remember that both Queensland and Victoria's premiers still have these sorts of emergency powers enacted today. So whilst they existed up to the last election or whatever time they expired, I'm not 100% sure on what time those appointments of the former Prime Minister were, the current premiers today in Victoria and in Queensland still have these emergency powers enacted. So if we are going to have a review, it should be across the board. There were Liberal states, there were Labor states, there was a Liberal federal government. It should absolutely all be on the table, not for political point scoring, but to make sure that if we are ever as a nation faced with something like this again, we know how to better handle it.
And Matt, I suppose you'll follow your Prime Minister's lead on this, but what should be the scope? A narrow one, which I think has kind of been telegraphed by Anthony Albanese, or I think eventually your government may get to a full-blown, whole of pandemic review, but do we take the Morrison matter in isolation initially?
I think we do, one crisis at a time, Craig. This was thrown up last week. It was completely out of the blue. No one had known that it even occurred. And it created a mini constitutional crisis in Australia. And it was appropriate for the Prime Minister to act quickly, to get the Solicitor General to look into this. And we're all keen to see what that advice is tomorrow. There's, of course, been the Senate inquiry that's been going on for a number of years now into the pandemic response, and they've made some recommendations. So further down the track, I think that can become the basis for review. But really keen to see what the Solicitor General has to say tomorrow.
The remedies, though, would seem pretty obvious to just keen observers, wouldn't it? Around the secrecy element anyway, leaving aside sort of high-level constitutional considerations, the issuing of a media release, for instance, Matt, would have overcome the problem in the first place, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think it certainly would have. There's an obligation on the Prime Minister to disclose these things. And the Governor-General's role has been discussed. I don't blame the Governor-General. He acted on the advice of the Prime Minister, as the convention says. But more broadly, Greg, I think it's a great opportunity to discuss our Constitution and its future because, as you know, a lot of this stuff isn't written down. It's all based on conventions. And when we do get into difficulties like this, there's no rule book that you can go to resolve these problems. So I think it brings in a broader question about those issues in the future.
Yeah, I think that's called codifying the conventions, Holly. Where would you stand on that? Or even just a micro slither of it, which might be a simple requirement for Government House, Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet or Prime Minister's Office to issue a 2-line media release?
Look, I don't think you're ever going to find in a constitution something stipulating a media release. But to Matt's broader point with regards to the Constitution, as someone who's had my own experiences with Section 44, I think at times we may need to have a review of the document and see where there are points that need to be clarified. Obviously, changing the Constitution in any shape or form is very, very complex. It requires a referendum. It's not simple to do. But if something was going to be, as you say, codified, it would need to be outside of the Constitution if you were looking at things like a media release being required in certain events.
That's fairly adventurous, though, as a suggestion, the one you're making here, Holly, that we take, a more root and branch review of...
Let's not get carried away, Greg.
Okay.
I'm not calling here for a broad review of the Constitution, but there are sections of the Constitution that we've seen these issues arise. Obviously, Section 44 was one. We've now seen within the Biodiversity Act and how that's been related with the Constitution and the length of time powers were able to be enacted under that. So there are things within the Constitution that do have determinations. I think there are a lot of things that are written in the Constitution that don't necessarily mean there's a constitutional crisis, but it's how it's being interpreted by the High Court today. Well,
it's certainly thrown up a few randoms, hasn't it, Matt, over the recent years. So there were the dual citizens in our midst and now this, and then the matter that's dear to your heart, a republic. You'd soon end up with a whole bank up of referenda under those sort of scenarios, wouldn't you?
Well, we are, Greg, because we haven't amended the Constitution since 1977, so we're out of practice. We haven't even put a question to the Australian people since 1999, and the framers of the Constitution intended for it to be updated, otherwise they wouldn't have included Section 128, albeit making it very difficult to do.
You obviously think Australians are more predisposed to going along with propositions, if they were put to them more often?
I think that we shouldn't be afraid to discuss our constitution with the Australian people, and this government under Anthony Albanese's leadership is certainly keen to do that. And the voice is the priority, as you know, and that's going to take time. We're going to do it slowly and progressively, but it's my hope that we do look at other issues like the Republic and like the validity of other sections of the Constitution into the future. We shouldn't waste these opportunities.
All right. Why don't we move away from Morrison matters and move on to something that's looming next week, the Jobs and Skills Summit. Matt, to you first of all. We're hearing demands for foreign worker visas to be processed more quickly, particularly from your home state of New South Wales. Should that rocket to the top of the to-do list around the time of the summit or thereafter?
Yeah, it's one of the topics that will certainly be dealt with, Greg, next week, and it is an urgent issue. You speak to any employer in Australia and they're facing skill shortages. You walk down any main road in the country and they'll all tell you the same thing, that they cannot get labour. Now, some of it is a hangover from the last decade and a failure to invest in skills and training, particularly at that TAFE and vocational level, but also in universities, and we're paying the price of that now. Some of it is a hangover from the policies of the previous government during the pandemic. For instance, anyone that was on a temporary visa, got no government support, couldn't afford to live and went back home.
Yeah.
So
that was
we're
deliberate. Did you argue with that at the time forcefully?
No,
Well,
they didn't.
We said that obviously you're going to need to skill the country up. And there was a number of areas where we were critical of the government in respect of the JobKeeper support. The university sector was one of them.
We wanted JobKeeper to keep going indefinitely.
You know, some of these policies are now coming home to roost. The other point I would make is that people are reluctant to travel at the moment because of COVID. So although there are visa positions there,
you can't fill them.
You can't fill them. And the delay in processing times is one of those issues. The time that it takes for an employer to get through all of those gates and get a visa approved is a long period of time, and that's something that we do need to do.
All right, to that point, Holly, I think you were just piping up there in our midst that some of the arguments, I think we might have even heard the Prime Minister, or was it Brendan O'Connor, making the point today that the temporary visa holders were kind of asked to move on when the pandemic hit. That was active policy, though, wasn't it, of the Morrison government?
Well, you know, hindsight, 2020 vision, here we go again. Labor Party was fully in support of these moves at the time because they were unprecedented times and a lot of countries were closing their borders. We were encouraging Australians to come home, and, you know, Matt will probably remember as well, Australians who decided not to come home because it wasn't bad where they were at that point in time, and then when it all blew up, were desperate to come home, but was very, very difficult for them at that time. It was something that was faced worldwide, and it was supported as policy by the Labor Party during the last government. But we can all look back as much as we like. It's about what we're going to do looking forward. No one who's running a small business desperate for staff at the moment could absolutely care one way or the other how much we debate what we did during the pandemic 2 years ago. What they want to know is how they're going to get staff now, how they're going to get people to do extra shifts. One of the things that we've proposed is allowing pensioners to work an extra day a week or work more before their pension is impacted. Yeah. This would provide a boost to the workforce. I don't think these things are something that we should be playing politics with at the moment. If a good idea is on the table, whether it's an increase in regional work visas, whether it is pensioners or others on welfare being able to work more shifts or an extra day without being impacted, I think all of those things should be taken for what sorts of benefits they can put into the economy and put into them quickly.
Yeah, there'll be a fair bit of discussion on that, obviously, next week. But I don't think, Matt Thistlethwaite, that your side of politics, the government has actually shut down any of those suggestions so far. The aged or pension workers pushing on into extra hours per week has been left wide open, I think.
Well, the government, the previous government, the opposition now have had a change of heart on that. I mean, they had a decade to implement that, but they didn't get around to doing it.
Well, we also didn't have record low unemployment levels and a desperate shortage of labour.
Obviously, with the Jobs and Skills Summit coming up next week, we want a fulsome discussion about all of the, potential solutions to the problems. And there's, key areas around the workforce of the future, productivity and full employment, skills enhancement and the training system, all of these issues come together as one next week, where we hopefully come out with an agreed set of principles and guidelines that will set the economy up for the next 20 years.
All in the mix and all for further discussion. We're going to wrap up our own conversation there, though. Holly Hughes and Matt Thistlethwaite, thanks both of you for joining us. We'll do it again.
Thanks, Greg.
soon.
See you,
Thanks
Matt.
to both.